At 10 p.m. on the night of March 21, 1984, sailors aboard the USS Kitty Hawk, a United States Navy aircraft carrier, were jolted by an unexpected impact while cruising through the Sea of Japan. Unbeknownst to them, their 80,000-ton vessel had just collided with a 5,200-ton K-314 Soviet attack submarine. The impact was brief, yet it echoed with the potential to ignite something far larger. It was the height of the Cold War, when every naval move was a chess piece in a global standoff. The collision was not just a freak accident. It was a moment that could have rewritten history. But how could such an encounter happen between two of the most sophisticated war machines ever built? To grasp the full context of this event, it is essential first to examine the measures and technologies that aircraft carriers and submarines use to prevent such collisions.
To understand how such a collision could even happen, we must first look at the very systems that are designed to prevent it. Aircraft carriers are the most protected and carefully managed ships at sea, surrounded by layers of defense and surveillance. Every radar sweep, sonar pulse, and radio transmission forms part of an intricate web meant to keep these floating air bases safe from both hostile forces and simple navigational errors. The USS Kitty Hawk, like other supercarriers, relied on a wide range of technologies and trained watch teams to maintain situational awareness. High-frequency radar constantly scanned the ocean's surface for vessels within miles of the fleet. Beneath the waves, sonar systems listened for the faint mechanical sounds that might betray a submarine's presence. Anti-submarine helicopters, fitted with dipping sonar and magnetic sensors, patrolled the perimeter, lowering equipment into the water to detect movement below.
Surrounding the carrier was its strike group, a formation of destroyers and cruisers whose job was to create a defensive shield. Each escort carried its own sonar arrays, depth charges, and torpedoes designed to hunt any lurking submarine before it could pose a threat. Together, this network of ships and aircraft formed a mobile fortress, operating with precision honed through countless drills. But technology alone was not enough. Naval operations also depended on human judgment, coordination, and adherence to international maritime rules. Crews were trained to follow the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, known as COLREGS. These rules dictated everything from lighting patterns at night to right-of-way protocols between ships. Even in wartime, such guidelines existed to avoid tragic misunderstandings. Yet, on that March night in 1984, all those layers, radar, sonar patrols, and seamanship, seemed to fail at once. For the Kitty Hawk and the Soviet K-314, the safety net designed to keep them apart was suddenly useless. To uncover why, we must now turn beneath the waves, where silence and stealth reign supreme, and where submarines operate under a very different set of rules. While aircraft carriers dominate the surface, submarines rule the unseen depths. Their environment is one of darkness, pressure, and silence, where survival depends on listening rather than seeing. The Soviet K-314, like most attack submarines of its era, relied on an array of sensors and instruments to navigate safely and remain undetected. Every decision made by its crew had to balance two conflicting needs: the need to know what surrounded them and the need to stay invisible. A submarine's first line of awareness is passive sonar. Instead of sending out sound waves, it listens. The ocean carries noise in remarkable ways, and even faint propeller beats or turbine hums can travel for miles. By analyzing these sounds, sonar operators can estimate distance, direction, and sometimes even the type of vessel nearby. It is a skill that requires training, patience, and intuition. Active sonar, on the other hand, emits sound pulses and listens for echoes, giving a clearer map of what lies ahead, but revealing the submarine's position in the process. For this reason, captains use it only when absolutely necessary, such as during high-speed maneuvers or when surfacing. Navigation systems inside a submarine are equally complex. Inertial navigation units use gyroscopes and accelerometers to track the vessel's motion with remarkable precision, even deep below where GPS cannot reach. Updated electronic charts display known underwater terrain, while a method known as gravity gradiometry measures subtle changes in Earth's gravity to detect hidden mountains or trenches. These tools help submarines avoid underwater hazards that no human eye could see. When operating on the surface, submarines follow the same navigation rules as any other ship. They display red and green lights, use radar, and follow COLREGS to ensure visibility and right-of-way. Yet this is also their most vulnerable phase, as surfacing too close to another vessel can lead to disaster. Training and discipline are what tie all these systems together. Soviet and American submarine crews spent months beneath the sea, learning to interpret every ping, vibration, and echo. But even with the best equipment and the most experienced sailors, mistakes still happen. The sea is vast, sound behaves unpredictably, and sometimes two vessels can find themselves sharing the same patch of water without realizing it until it is too late. That is precisely what seems to have occurred on that cold night in 1984. Despite all precautions, the K-314 and the USS Kitty Hawk converged on a single point in the sea, one hidden below and one gliding above. To understand how this became possible, we must look at the machines themselves, the Soviet submarine and the American carrier, and the secret rivalry that brought them so dangerously close. The Soviet K-314 was part of a powerful lineage of attack submarines built to challenge Western dominance at sea. Known within NATO as the Victor class, these submarines were sleek, fast, and engineered for one purpose: to hunt and track enemy ships, especially American aircraft carriers. Between the 1960s and 1980s, the Soviet Union produced dozens of these nuclear-powered vessels, each an evolution of the last, combining endurance with deadly precision. The Victor-class design was notable for its teardrop hull, a shape that reduced drag and allowed high underwater speeds. It was built not for comfort, but for pursuit, capable of diving deep and moving swiftly through the ocean. The K-314, like other members of the Victor II and Victor III series, carried an array of torpedoes and sonar systems meant to detect and engage American submarines or surface ships long before being detected itself. When the Victor III appeared, Western intelligence agencies were startled by a strange feature on its tail section, a large pod mounted on the vertical stabilizer. No one outside the Soviet Navy knew what it was. Some analysts speculated that it housed an experimental propulsion system or even a new kind of weapon. In time, it was discovered to contain a towed sonar array, a sophisticated listening device that could stretch behind the submarine to detect sounds at great distances. This technology allowed Soviet subs to shadow carrier groups from afar, collecting valuable data on movement and tactics. The K-314's mission on that March night was simple on paper, but dangerous in practice: to track the movements of the USS Kitty Hawk and its accompanying strike group. Soviet intelligence wanted to understand how the Americans operated their carriers, what their defensive patterns looked like, and how quickly they could respond to a submarine's presence. It was the ultimate game of stealth and observation. But shadowing a carrier required precision, and one small miscalculation could close the gap too much. In the darkness below, that is exactly what happened. The K-314 crept too close to the surface, perhaps misjudging its depth or the carrier's position. Above, the Kitty Hawk steamed ahead, unaware that a submarine was rising in its path. The stage was set for a collision that neither side could have anticipated. The USS Kitty Hawk was no ordinary ship. At the time of the collision, she embodied the might and prestige of the United States Navy, a moving city at sea designed to project power across the world's oceans. Weighing over 80,000 tons and stretching more than 1,000 feet in length, she was essentially a floating airbase capable of launching dozens of aircraft at a moment's notice. Her crew numbered nearly 5,000, including sailors, pilots, and support staff who worked around the clock to keep operations smooth and disciplined. Commissioned in 1961, the Kitty Hawk had served through decades of Cold War tension. She was the lead ship of her class and represented a bridge between earlier carrier designs and the supercarriers that would follow. Her decks were constantly alive with motion, jets roaring off catapults, helicopters lifting supplies, and crews conducting maintenance under the watchful eyes of officers who knew that precision was everything. To many in the Navy, she was not just a warship, but a living symbol of American readiness and dominance at sea. For 10 years, the Kitty Hawk had been stationed in Yokosuka, Japan, serving as the forward deployed carrier of the Pacific Fleet. This position placed her within reach of vital waters, where American and Soviet forces constantly shadowed each other. Each patrol was a reminder that peace depended on vigilance. The Cold War may have been a conflict of ideology, but on the water, it was fought through presence and surveillance. By 1984, the Kitty Hawk was taking part in routine exercise in the Sea of Japan, her radar systems sweeping the horizon, her escorts forming a defensive ring. To the crew, it was a standard operation, another test of coordination between ships and aircraft. Yet beyond their sensors, hidden deep in the dark water, K314 was quietly trailing them, collecting data and waiting for a closer look. As the Kitty Hawk continued through the cold moonlit sea that night, her crew had no idea that beneath them, a Soviet submarine was closing in. Neither radar nor sonar had yet sounded a warning. The stage was nearly set for a moment that would jolt both nations into silence. The night of March 21st, 1984, seemed uneventful aboard the USS Kitty Hawk. The carrier sailed steadily through calm seas, her lights dimmed for night operations, the crew following the usual routine of watches and maintenance. Air operations had concluded hours earlier, and the ship's massive engines maintained a steady hum as she moved through the Sea of Japan. Below the surface, K314's crew operated in near-total darkness, guided by sonar readings and navigation instruments. Their goal was simple: observe without being seen. But submarines live by delicate calculations, and one small error in depth or course can change everything. As K314 maneuvered, it likely rose closer to periscope depth, possibly to verify its position or monitor the carrier visually. In those final moments before disaster, the submarine was almost directly in the carrier's path. At 10:07 p.m., the quiet was shattered. A deep metallic crash reverberated through both vessels, followed by a violent shudder that sent men tumbling to the decks. On the Kitty Hawk, alarms blared instantly. Crew members raced to damaged control stations, unsure of what had struck them. Some believed they had hit a floating container, or perhaps an escort ship. No one immediately considered the possibility. Kitty Hawk slowed to assess the situation. Radar and lookouts soon confirmed a shocking sight. A Soviet submarine, damaged and motionless, had surfaced directly ahead. Both crews understood the gravity of what had happened. In the midst of Cold War tension, two nuclear-capable vessels carrying aircraft armed with nuclear weapons had collided in peacetime waters. On the bridge of the Kitty Hawk, officers quickly ordered communications to higher command. The United States Navy had just come dangerously close to an international crisis. Soviet warships in the area began to converge on the scene to assist K314, while American escorts took up defensive positions around their carrier. The immediate question on every sailor's mind was simple: how could this have happened at all? To answer that, one had to consider not just technology and navigation, but the unspoken rivalry that drove both navies to push their limits in the first place. The Sea of Japan, moments earlier calm and indifferent, had turned into a stage of silent confrontation. The USS Kitty Hawk floated steadily in the dark, its lights now blazing across the decks as sailors worked to assess damage and prepare for any response. Not far away, the crippled Soviet submarine K314 drifted at the surface, smoke still rising from its damaged sail. The two vessels, enemies in doctrine but not in declared war, now faced each other in uneasy stillness. Within minutes, Soviet surface ships began moving toward the area. Their radar signatures appeared on the Kitty Hawk's displays, prompting immediate readiness among the carrier's escorts. Destroyers and cruisers adjusted positions, sonar operators sharpened their focus, and anti-submarine helicopters hovered on standby. Any misinterpreted signal or maneuver could have triggered a chain reaction with consequences beyond imagination. Captain David Rogers, commanding the Kitty Hawk, ordered radio silence except for necessary communications. He knew that any aggressive move could escalate the situation. The collision itself had already been catastrophic enough, but the political implications were far more dangerous. The presence of nuclear power on both vessels added to the tension. A reactor breach or misread radar return could have set the stage for a confrontation neither side wanted. Offers of assistance were made through naval channels, but the Soviet ships ignored them. Pride and protocol dictated that they handle their own. American officers watched through binoculars as Soviet crews worked through the night, their deck lights glinting across the waves. Despite the tension, there was also a strange mutual restraint. Neither navy aimed weapons, and both avoided maneuvers that could appear threatening. Each side understood that a single mistake could draw in far more than ships and sailors. It could drag the entire world into crisis. As dawn approached, the Soviet vessels began towing the damaged submarine away. The Kitty Hawk remained on station, its crew exhausted but aware that they had narrowly avoided catastrophe. The incident would soon reach headlines around the world, but for the men aboard those ships, the weight of that night would never be forgotten. Yet the question lingered among American officers and analysts. Why had the Soviet captain allowed his submarine to come so dangerously close to a carrier group? The answer, when examined through Cold War strategy, revealed the dangerous cat-and-mouse games that define this era of silent confrontation. The collision between the USS Kitty Hawk and K-314 did not happen in isolation. It was born from years of relentless competition between two naval superpowers that had turned the oceans into a shadowed battlefield. During the Cold War, the sea was as much a front line as the skies of Europe or the deserts of the Middle East. Every ship, submarine, and aircraft was part of a global contest for information, presence, and dominance. The Soviet Navy had spent decades narrowing the gap with the United States, shifting from a coastal defense force into a blue water fleet capable of operating across the globe. Its submarines, particularly the Victor class, were central to that transformation. These vessels were fast, quiet for their time, and able to trail American carrier strike groups for weeks. Tracking a carrier like the Kitty Hawk offered valuable insight into U.S. naval operations. How often aircraft launched, how escorts moved, and how quickly the Americans responded to a possible threat. Every detail was intelligence gold. Soviet commanders were encouraged to shadow U.S. fleets as closely as possible without being detected. The line between observation and provocation was thin, and captains often... The United States Navy, for its part, accepted this game as part of the strategic landscape. Carrier strike groups trained constantly to locate and evade submarines. Anti-submarine aircraft, destroyers, and surveillance systems worked together in layered coordination, while intelligence teams studied every sonar trace, hoping to predict the Soviets' next move. The collision on that March night was not the result of aggression, but rather the inevitable outcome of this high-stakes pursuit. K-314's mission had likely been to track the Kitty Hawk from a distance, yet in the dark and unpredictable sea, even the best-trained crews could misjudge speed, bearing, or depth. What followed was not a deliberate act, but a reminder of how fragile the balance of peace could be when rivals operated so near one another. In the wake of the incident, both governments reacted cautiously, aware that overreaction could turn embarrassment into escalation. Yet, behind closed doors, each side studied the event intensely. For the Americans, it was a chance to learn more about Soviet technology. For the Soviets, it was a warning of how close their surveillance tactics had come to catastrophe. News of the collision reached Washington and Moscow within hours. Governments understood the danger of public panic or political misinterpretation. In 1984, the Cold War was entering one of its frostier phases, and neither side could afford an incident that hinted at recklessness with nuclear-powered vessels. In Washington, the Pentagon confirmed that the Kitty Hawk had been struck, but emphasized that there was no serious damage or injuries. Naval spokesmen described the collision as unfortunate, yet insisted that American procedures had been followed correctly. Behind the scenes, senior officers analyzed radar and sonar logs, reconstructing the moments before impact. The carrier's systems had functioned properly, and the fault appeared to lie with the submarine's sudden surfacing. Admiral James Watkins, the chief of naval operations, stated that the Soviet captain had shown poor seamanship, calling his decision hazardous and inexplicable. The Soviets, however, were less forthcoming. Their official statements downplayed the incident, describing it as a minor contact at sea. Yet intelligence sources soon confirmed that K-314 had been heavily damaged and towed back to its home port under escort. The submarine's sail and upper hull were crushed, and its reactor compartment narrowly escaped serious compromise. Although no radiation leaked, the damage was enough to end the vessel's patrol prematurely. Under the 1972 Agreement on the Prevention of Incidents on and over the High Seas, both navies were obligated to avoid actions that could be perceived as threatening. The collision, therefore, became a test of that accord. The United States accused the Soviet submarine of violating international navigation rules by surfacing without proper lighting and by approaching too closely to a surface vessel. Soviet officials offered little public defense, likely aware that admitting error would undermine their image of control. Among U.S. naval officers, the event became a case study in Cold War risk. They understood that both navies operated under constant pressure to gather intelligence, and that Soviet crews were often ordered to track American carriers at unsafe distances. Some speculated that the submarine had miscalculated its depth, or had been caught in a thermal layer that distorted sonar readings. Others believed that the captain, eager to gain visual, although the incident was quickly contained diplomatically, its echoes traveled far. It exposed the razor-thin margin between surveillance and catastrophe, and reminded both nations that even a single error could light a spark that neither side could extinguish. Yet despite the tension and embarrassment, one truth became clear. Both crews had acted with restraint in the aftermath, preventing a collision from turning into a confrontation. The final chapter of this event would not be written in panic, but in quiet reflection about how close the world had come to disaster. When historians revisit that March night, they see more than a freak accident. They see two crews trapped between duty and danger, navigating not only the ocean but also the thin line between peace and war. The sea remembers the impact, even if the waves have long since erased the scars. The Kitty Hawk would continue her service for decades, while K-314's fate was less fortunate, eventually decommissioned and scrapped. Yet for those who knew the story, their brief and violent meeting under the dark waters of the Pacific remained a symbol of how fragile calm can be when nations listen for each other in silence.